Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. In today's video, what I want to discuss is ownership, which is something of a conundrum in early Buddhism. Some of us will know that the Buddha asked us to think of the world in three different related ways. To think of the world in terms of, this is not mine, I am not this is not myself. Now, in a recent video of mine, I discussed the latter two of these, that I am not this and this is not myself. And so in today's video, I want to look at the first of these. This is not mine. What does that mean? How do we interpret that? How do we understand that? Well, the Buddha here is discussing ownership. In particular, he's focusing on ownership of what are known as the five aggregates, the parts that make up the human person, the body and the four mental parts. He's saying that we don't have any real ownership over these five aggregates. And since ownership over our body and our mind is, I think, pretty much inarguably the most intimate form of ownership that we can have, it's pretty clear that the Buddha also intends this same argument, this same claim, to be true of other things that we claim we own as well, all of the things that we own less intimately. Okay, so that said, what is the conundrum here? Well, the conundrum is this. We also, in Buddhism, in early Buddhism, have the five precepts, one of which, the second of which, is to avoid stealing or taking that which is not given. So the conundrum is, how can we have stealing without real ownership? After all, if none of us really owns anything, then how can we really steal anything from anybody else? Well, this is pretty clearly a confusion here, but it'll take a little bit of undoing to get at precisely what the confusion is. Let's begin with a quick discussion on why we should avoid thoughts of ownership, avoid thinking of the world in terms of possessions. Well, to begin with, thinking of the world in this way tends to promote greed, tends to promote an idea of taking possession of as much as we possibly can, that we identify ourselves with the things that we own, and what this kind of mindset tends to do is to promote the notion that the bigger we are, the more important we are, the more we own, and so there's essentially no end to our rapaciousness. In one early sutta, the Buddha is approached by Mara, who is the tempter in Buddhism, and Mara tempts the Buddha by saying, you should become a powerful ruler, that you are so powerful that if you wanted, you could change the Himalayas into mountains of gold. And the Buddha said, basically, that even if I could change the mountains, the Himalayas into mountains of gold, people would still want a second mountain of gold or a second Himalayas. That wouldn't ever be enough. And of course, the idea being that if they had two, they'd want three. There's no end to how much people can want. This mindset feeds strife in ourselves as we strive to gain all that we can. It also feeds strife with other people because we are competing with them over what end up being a limited source of funds or resources that we can, either we own it or they do. And this mindset eventually leads to disagreements, to hatreds, to violence, even to warfare. In one of his early suttas, the longer discourse on the massive suffering, the Buddha describes this kind of syndrome in a lot of detail, talking about how we go from the regular, everyday greeds of ordinary life into greater and greater kinds of greed and greater tendencies towards hatred and strife and violence with each other, even to warfare between countries. I mean, that being an immediate birth from the kind of greed that this kind of acquisitiveness promotes. All we need to do is look at today's headlines to see the results of this kind of greed around the world. So it's unskillful to look at the world in terms of ownership because ownership conditions greed and hatred. and eventually violence, pain, suffering. It's also unskillful to look at the world in terms of ownership because ownership is bound up in this notion of control. We feel that what we own, we control. In the Buddha's second sermon, he goes into a long discussion about how we don't even have control over our own minds and bodies, and so therefore we can't be truly said to own them. In the words of the Thai meditation master Ajahn Chah, and we went over this particular book in our Patreon book club. If you're interested in that, take a look over at my Patreon page. But in any event, in his words, if the body could talk, it would be telling us all day long, "You're not my owner, you know." Actually, it's telling us all the time, but it's Dhamma language, so we're unable to understand it. For instance, the sense organs of eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body are continually changing, but I've never seen them ask permission from us even once. Like when we have a headache or a stomach ache, the body never asks permission first, it just goes right ahead following its natural course. This shows that the body doesn't allow anyone to be its owner. It doesn't have an owner. This is true of our bodies and minds, which we think we own quite intimately, but it's even more true of things that we own less intimately. Our clothing gets stained and torn, cars that we own will rust, roofs will leak. All of these things will demonstrate through these kinds of behaviors that we don't really control them. All of these things change and decay over time, so it's just not skillful, it's not wise to take notions of ownership too seriously. Doing so will only produce suffering, or dukkha, the suffering of taking our car to the repair shop again and again, or eventually to the junkyard when it finally gives up the ghost, the suffering of repainting the walls because we've had another leak, the suffering of rebuilding our house when it burns down in a fire. You can ask me about that one. These kinds of suffering are exacerbated if we feel that we have real control over our lives when we don't. Okay, then you say, Doug, what's the big deal then? If we don't really own anything, then who cares if somebody steals it, right? Well, that's exactly the problem, is that we do care. We care intimately if somebody steals something from us. Theft causes distress, it causes hatred and anger, it causes dukkha as well. I mean, the problem is that we aren't enlightened. None of us are enlightened people yet, and the Buddha was a pragmatist. Essentially, if we put words in the Buddha's mouth, we might say that ownership is a legal fiction. That is, it's a kind of a fiction, and nobody really owns anything, nobody really controls anything, but it's a legal one. What does that mean? Well, the laws themselves are fictions of a kind. They're written up by societies, by people. They're oftentimes incorrect, but they have real consequences, real social and political consequences. If you violate them, at least, most of the time, that's the point of a law, is that if you violate it, there are consequences. They're real consequences. And indeed, one of the things the Buddha does discuss are just those consequences. That if you're caught stealing, you're going to have a bad time of it, especially in ancient India. For the Buddha, the layperson had responsibilities. Among those responsibilities was to guard their wealth, was to spend their wealth on those around them to help make them happy or keep them happy. These are the kinds of things that the Buddha recommended. All of these responsibilities require there to be some form of socio-political organization that can make this possible. That is to say, that the Buddha pragmatically understood that there was indeed a limited conventional kind of ownership that was backed by socio-political power, legal power. But for the Buddha, the better, the wiser path was to understand the true fictional nature of all of this and give it up, in a sense, to then become a monastic, somebody who literally owned nothing or next to nothing except perhaps, you might say, their robe and bowl, if they even owned that. However, having said this, we have to understand that even the monastic only could exist in a socio-political context in which there was lay support that would provide the monastics with the requisite food, lodging, clothing, medicine that they would need to survive. So all of this has its complexity. None of it is simple. All of it is nuanced. And again, the Buddha was something of a pragmatist about this. If you're interested in the Buddha's views on this kind of control that he discussed in the second sermon, I'll leave a link to an earlier video I did on that subject in case you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.